The inspector arrived on a Tuesday. I know that because Tuesdays were slag sorting days at the Rakthar outpost, and the noise from the conveyor lines made every conversation feel like shouting into a storm. He didn't seem bothered by the noise. He stood at the intake desk with a battered data slate under one arm and asked the shift foreman, in a perfectly level voice, to see the labor registry. Not a summary. The registry itself. I was watching from the sorting line. I watched everyone who came through that door. 3 years of watching had taught me which inspectors filed courtesy reports and left, and which ones actually read. His name, I would learn later, was Garrett Voss. He had the look of a man who had stood in a great many loud rooms and found none of them particularly alarming. Close-cropped gray at the temples, a jaw that had been broken at least once and healed slightly wrong, matte gray authority vest with a name patch that had been washed so many times the letters had faded to suggestion. He was not young. He was not performing anything. He sat down at the intake desk with the registry open on his slate, and he started at page 1. Nobody started at page 1. I told myself it didn't matter. I had told myself that about every inspector for 3 years. The Rakthar contractor, Duvin Mast, was good at what he did. The contracts were clean on their surface. The suppression compound in my bloodstream had no name in the standard labor registry. It was logged as a routine immune stabilizer, the kind common enough in deep core environments that no one questioned it. My identity marker, the royal brand that ran from my left wrist to my elbow in the bioluminescent tracery of my bloodline, showed on no scan as anything other than a healed dermal injury. Mast had told me this the day I arrived, in the same flat tone he used for everything. You are a laborer. You have always been a laborer. The paperwork agrees. I sorted slag. I kept my head down. I watched the door. By the 3rd hour, Voss had moved from the registry to the medical files. This was unusual. Medical files were a separate request. Most inspectors didn't bother. I saw Mast approach him from across the floor, smiling the smile he used on officials, and I saw Voss listen to it, nod once, and return to his slate. Mast stood there for a moment, smile still in place, and then walked away. The 4th hour, Voss stood up and walked the floor. He stopped at my station. Not because I was notable. I had worked 3 years at not being notable, but because my station was the last one on the conveyor line, and he was walking every station in order. He looked at my hands working, looked at my face, and said, "How long have you been on site?" 3 years, I said. Voluntary contract. The words sat between us. I had signed the contract. Masked people had put the stylus in my hand the day I arrived and told me where to press, and I had been too disoriented from the transit sedation to read it clearly. And by the time I could read clearly, the suppression compound was already in my blood, and my mark was already gone, and the contract was already filed in the registry as voluntary and valid. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Not the way most people looked at me, through me, past me, at the slot I occupied on the conveyor. He looked at my face. Then he looked at my left forearm, where the mark was not, and then back at my face. "The immune stabilizer notation in your file," he said. "Do you know the compound name?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I told him. I told him the full compound name, the clinical designation, the half-life, and what it suppressed. I told him in the flat voice I used for everything at Rakthar, the voice that had learned not to carry weight. I expected him to nod and move on. I expected him to file it away as background noise and write a courtesy report. He pulled up something on his slate. He read it. He looked at my arm again. "Thank you," he said, and he walked back to the intake desk. I sorted slag for another 2 hours. My hands were steady. I had learned to keep my hands steady. But something had shifted in the room the way pressure shifts before a deep core tremor, a change in the quality of the air that the body registers before the mind does. At the 6th hour, Voss called Mast to the intake desk. I could not hear the words over the conveyor noise. I could see Mast's face, which had dropped the smile, and I could see Voss's face, which had not changed at all. Voss set the slate on the desk and turned it so Mast could read the screen. Mast read it. He said something. Voss said something back, one sentence, short, and picked the slate up again. Mast left the room. One of the authority's secondary staff, a young Vithani-fluent clerk who had come with Voss, appeared at my station 15 minutes later with a medical kit and a sealed vial. She told me that the ORLA inspector had filed a Class 2 compliance violation against Rakthar operations, that the suppression compound in my bloodstream had been identified as a prohibited identity inhibitor under Outer Reach Labor Code Section 41, and that I was entitled to a reversal treatment immediately. She said it in the careful way people say official things, making sure each word lands. I held out my arm. The reversal compound was cold going in. I had not felt cold in 3 years. The Rakthar lines ran hot. I felt it move up my forearm, and I held very still. The way you hold still for something you have been waiting for so long you are afraid motion will break it. The mark came back slowly. First a warmth under the skin, then a faint luminescence, pale at first, the color of moonlight through cloud. Then brighter, running the full length from wrist to elbow in the branching tracery of the Vedhani royal line. The mark of my mother's house. The mark they had told me was gone. The mark that had been there the entire time, waiting under the surface of everything they had layered over it. The clerk took a scan. The reading came back in 4 seconds. She showed me the screen without comment. The identity designation was clear. The contract, flagged as obtained under prohibited suppression conditions, had been voided retroactively as of the filing timestamp. I was not a laborer. I had never been a laborer. The paperwork now agreed. I found Voss at the outpost's outer corridor, already packing his slate into a worn carry case. He had the exit clearance document for me on a single printed sheet, physical paper, which the authority used for records that needed to be carried rather than transmitted. He held it out, and I took it. I looked at him. I did not have words organized yet. 3 years of words had gone somewhere. I couldn't reach them quickly. What I managed was, "You read the suppression compound name. You already knew what it was." "I recognized it from another filing," he said. "Different outpost, 2 years ago. Same contractor. You believed it before the scan confirmed." He seemed to consider whether this needed an answer. "The compound doesn't get into a medical file by accident," he said. "Someone put it there for a reason." It wasn't hard to figure out what the reason was. He looked at my forearm, where the mark was still bright, luminescence settling slowly to its resting glow. "I'm glad it came back clean." He said it the way a man says a thing that is simply true, not to be kind, not to perform anything, just because it was the fact of the matter, and he was a man who named facts. I folded the exit clearance and held it against my chest. My mark glowed against my own skin, patient and present, the way it had always been. "I should tell you," I said, "who my mother was." "You don't have to tell me anything," Voss said. "You're clear to leave." I told him anyway. I wanted one person in that outpost to know, and he was the one who had read far enough to find it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded, not with surprise and not without weight. Then he picked up his carry case, told me the transport for the Outer Reach relay station left at 1800, and walked toward the exit like a man with 3 more outposts on his inspection schedule. I stood in the corridor of the Rakthar outpost with my name back in my skin and a piece of paper in my hand, and no wall between me and the door. I walked out.